Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Good Journeys Tarot. I am Rosemary, and I'm so glad to see some of you are waiting for today's live. Welcome, Tarot Stash and Ange from Tiny Trinkets and Tarot, who will be moderating for me today on YouTube. And today, I just as I do sometimes on Friday night when I'm having a glass of wine, decided to do something on spur of the moment and reached out to Benebell Wen about possibly coming on my channel, and she was like, "Oh, sure, I'm available tomorrow." And I was like, "Well, wow, that's a little soon for me. I need to prepare so I can speak intelligently with her." And so she is here with us today. She, of course, is the author of Holistic Tarot, and which is my go-to book, and also the Spirt Keepers Tarot, not one, but now 3 editions of that deck. And we'll be looking at some of those cards today as we talk about gender in Esoteric Tarot. So welcome, Benebell Wen.
Hi, Rosemary.
Hi. So glad you could join us today
My pleasure.
for our chat. And Ange is sharing your YouTube channel. You also have a website where you do some really great blog posts, very thought-provoking things coming out of your site there.
Thank you.
So one of the things that keeps coming up in my brain as I study tarot is, is gender, mainly because I've transitioned from male to female, but also because many people in my community now are somewhere on a spectrum of gender rather than identifying as either male or female. And I think to myself, okay, well, that's great in some decks where it's I guess they're made for readers rather than being esoteric in nature. And so they will change the names, or they will change the genders of the cards, or they might use some tool like I'm doing right now with my deck of silhouettes so that it could, in theory, be anyone, right? But I love esoteric decks like yours, the Thoth, the Smith Waite, where they lay Kabbalistic and astrological correspondences on them. And but how do we work with gender in esoteric tarot? Because it seems like there is a duality there, is really what I wanted to chat about today. So what are your thoughts on the duality
I think
that we
when you're talking about Western occultism and also Eastern occultism, this concept, which I'm going to take from Rosicrucian terminology, the alchemical wedding, right? The concept of the sacred marriage or an alchemical wedding is really important in both schools or traditions of the occult. And that's the concept of the union of opposites. So I think we evolve in our understanding and our enlightenment as a collective society through the centuries. And at the time of certain occult, like philosophies, the easiest concept for them to understand the idea of a union of opposites is through that binary gendered male female. So when you talk about a union of opposites at a particular time in human history, the easiest way to represent that through a metaphor is the male and the female together in that sort of heterosexual union, right? But as a global society, we do evolve. And so as we evolve, our occult traditions, our occult philosophies also have to evolve. And you do start to see that now. So I think that's the reason it was a certain way at a certain point. But then I also wanted to kind of caveat that with Eastern occultism. So in Eastern occultism, we have the idea of yin yang, yin and yang. And people often peg yin as female and yang as male. But it's not necessarily that. Yin and yang is more about internal alchemy. So it's a better representation to say zeros and ones in a binary code, right? So there is everything is all zeros and everything is either male and everything is either female. There isn't that binary. It's more Jungian in that there's an anima and animus in each one of us. So zeros and ones, for example, the letter W is, I think, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1. So each single idea, each single unit isn't all yin or all yang. It's a combination of yin and yang. So it's that tension and the fluidity between the two that makes something a single unit. And so the union of opposites, the sacred marriage, is not necessarily one unit together. That's opposite. It's the opposites within each one of us, I think.
You mentioned the sacred union, and I've recently been reading the book for the Rosicrucian Arcanum, the Rota Mundi, and there is that whole section about the marriage, and that's one of the things that got me to thinking about this topic. The other, having just recently studied the Kabbalah Tree of Life with Mama Gina, for me now, I'm looking at Esoteric Tarot and I'm thinking to myself, well, maybe it's not a duality. Maybe it's a triplicity. One of the things, but so like you have Keter, and Keter gives way to Chokmah and then Benai almost instantly. So, and Keter being neither male nor female or masculine or feminine, but giving way to both in a sense, to me says, okay, there is this third originating idea that is neither and both. And I actually pulled this card out to talk about this idea because I loved this card when I saw it. It came out when I was doing my legal and medical transition. And it was the first time that I had seen a world card that really captured the idea of the divine androgyny or intersex in a way that wasn't female. Like usually nowadays, when you see people printing decks with the world card, they choose to a voluptuous woman versus that kind of androgynous figure. The reason that I brought this up is because I've read this week where in Waite's deck, the idea hidden there was that the ones that were actually nude, but you didn't see any genitals, were meant to be,
Intersex.
androgynous or intersex, giving way to that idea that there are, the divine entity that is neither male nor female, but is both. And it kind of gives an interesting meaning to some of the cards now when I look at them. Like when I was looking at the star and thought, well, okay, in terms of this card and this card as divine entities, the divine at the, beginning, the start of things, to the divine at, say, the end of things, more mature. And then in the moon, we have no figure, the divine not present. So we get that shadow. And so that's where my brain has been going this week. So what are your thoughts on your cards that you were just showing? You were going to comment on.
Gender was very much on my mind during the first edition in terms of how to represent the union of opposites, the alchemical wedding, sacred marriage, and how to represent gender. It was something that I constantly tried to think about, like, how do I do this, right? With the world card, I definitely wanted the divine androgyny. And later on, I showed the new world card when you were talking about the union being a triplicity, because that's exactly what I wanted to make sure was expressed in the newer evolution of the world card. And also this, I wanted to be very Captain Obvious. There's a starfish front and center, and the starfish is intersex. And the concept of gender is, we don't really understand the concept of gender in the starfish. And so that's why I put that front and center in that card. I thought that was really interesting. What are my thoughts on how I think I wanted to make sure it captured the idea of what we consider the socialized concept of masculinity and femininity, because I think that is a social reality, right? Like we can't deny that this is something that we have made into reality through our constructs. At the same time, how do you grapple with this socialized reality versus a natural reality and a biodiversity that is part of the universe that we live in. So that was kind of the balance and tension that I wanted to really express, both in the first edition and the later SKT Revelation edition.
So one of the things that made me think of you for this conversation was that in your walkthrough of the Revelation, you were talking about the magician and the high priestess. And you had mentioned, after talking about how you had played with gender in those cards, that there were some other references to the transgender community in the priestess, which I've not figured out, and I'd like to know them.
Oh, the priestess. She's a Sumerian priestess of Inanna. So traditionally, they were male. Who some of them were transitioned into female back then in 2500 BC, and at the same time, some were just cross-dressing, and they still had families, they had children, the whole thing. So it was both. And it was this very fluid concept of gender that was very accepted and celebrated during this one festival. And then there was that poem that I found by, I think it was Anandwana from 2300 BC. And she's considered the first poet or first author in human history, and she wrote a poem that was like an homage to the goddess Inanna, and she lists all the powers of Inanna, and one of the powers of Inanna, like they're saying, oh, blessed Inanna, you who have the power to turn a man into a woman into a man. And this is back in 2300 BC, right? And so there's this idea that is so baked into a natural, intuitive understanding of how the universe works. Now we're only catching up and kind of evolving back to that understanding now. So I really wanted to highlight and underscore that in the priestess card.
So
yes,
this is the card that we've been talking about. And you did something, and there was something that you did similarly in your megas.
The Magus is Himiko. She's a shamanist queen of Wa. The kingdom of Wa is one of the older names for Japan, before Japan became a nation. And she was notoriously known to have cross-dressed in men's clothing. So I know the way she's dressed, I think in a Western mind, we might not necessarily associate it with men's clothing. But if you know the sort of Asian cultural dress, like that understanding, then you can see it's clearly men's clothing.
Right. I know that in most decks where gender comes up is people who want to balance it throughout the deck, because they say that traditionally the decks are all mostly masculine. They'll play with the court cards, and so you now get a mixture of kings and queens who are male and female, or knights who are female, that type of thing. Tell us how you worked gender into your court cards.
I think, so that was another thing I wanted to talk about, right? Like, so courts, traditionally, we think of the king is a representation of active, assertive energy. Since it's active, asserting energy, we say, oh, they're all male. And then the queen, again, in alchemy, the queen concept is submissive energy, passive submissive energy. So then, oh, queens are all female. And that's kind of how we've always classified the court hierarchy. So visually, what I wanted to do was to reconstruct our preconceptions of that idea of what is assertive energy and what is submissive energy. So there is now a balance of male and female representation in the kings as active energy and the queens as more passive energy or nurturing. I think we now as a society decide we don't necessarily like using the words passive or submissive. We prefer to use the words maybe nurturing and cultivating or developmental. So that's what I wanted to make sure I did in the kings and queens specifically, because ultimately the kings and queens in the tarot courts go toward, again, that alchemical wedding.
Great. My brain. Look at my notes here.
We can talk about anything, Rosemary.
Yeah. we've hit my big topics, which were about the dualistic aspect of tarot and all. Um, One of the things I'm finding is that since I've started working with a revelation deck, is that I'm seeing cards differently than I have in the past. So, like, I've always hated the Emperor, but for some reason, this depiction of the Emperor to me feels okay. It doesn't feel like dominance to me, like the Emperor usually does, but it more so feels like a representation of this part of me, which it has the power to shape their own domain and destiny. And so that was one of the cards that changed in all three editions, and I think it's going to a really great place. So
I can talk about that a little bit. So, in terms of what you just showed, that is King Menelik I, legendary Ethiopian king who was the son of King Solomon. Yeah, the King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And then in his young adult years, he traveled back to Jerusalem to meet his father, King Solomon. And there's a legend that at that time, King Solomon passed on the Ark of the Covenant to Menelik I. Menelik I brought the Ark of the Covenant to the kingdom of Ethiopia, and that is where the Ark of the Covenant is to this day. That's one of the historical legends. So I depicted Menelik I in that in the Emperor card. Now I struggled so much with the Emperor card. Before that, I was thinking of using Suleiman, and then some of the earlier renditions were just awful. And then you could see some of the evolutions of it. Like I think because I live in this particular patrilineal society, we have this concept of how to depict that masculine energy that is that King Charlemagne, that, you know, the emperor energy. And so I went way too severe, right? Like it wasn't looking right. And then I started thinking, you know, so this is actually like weirdly, and it might ruin the card, not ruin the card, but like I was trying to think of like the actual concepts of masculinity in my life, right? And my father is very much a masculine dominant guy, but he's also artistic and poetic and calm and nurturing and gentle. And then he and Obama, so Obama, President Obama has always reminded me of my father because they have the same vibe. Like President Obama and my dad had that same energy. So that'll give you a sense of my father's energy. And then so I started using that energy, that masculine energy, to figure out how I can represent the Emperor card. Still have that King Charlemagne vibe, but then at the same time show that nurturing, that more gentle, like open and inviting energy, the father figure you actually want to go to. So that's the personal side, the personal story to the Emperor card.
Yeah. To me, for some reason, I immediately thought when I realized that I was connecting with this card more than I usually do, that there were no mountains, and I don't know. Maybe it's that starkness of the terrain that's always gotten me more so than the actual figure of the emperor themselves.
The King
Another,
Midas type in the RWS, right?
yeah, yeah. The another card that in this card has been plaguing me ever since I got the deck. Not just this specific card, but the Chariot. And
I want to ask you for your gossip. Tell me the tea about why you don't like that card. Because I
well,
saw the sibling. I
okay.
want to
So
know.
when I first saw this card, I immediately pictured the Chariot in the Pride Tarot, which is actually a depiction of Caitlyn Jenner.
Oh,
And so I immediately was like, "Oh no, I can't this card. I'm not sure I can work with it now because it reminds me somewhat of that card, I guess because it's a feminine figure with long hair, but after I've worked with it a bit and it in the chariot keeps coming up as a theme in my life this year so far. I really love it. And I've started seeing this card differently. I've always seen the chariot as kind of that control, that will to move forward, that type of thing. But now I'm looking at it and I'm going, and I'm focusing more on the idea that sometimes we have to let the divine pull us forward. Like, these Sphinx probably have been down this path before and know where they're going, and I can let them carry me. And that's, I think, when I finally gelled with this card more so than when I first saw it. But I actually, when I first saw it, I was like, oh wait, that's putting this image in my mind that I don't want.
That's so funny. That's Eos, the goddess of the Titaness, goddess of dawn.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions for Benebell about her deck, or any thoughts on gender they'd like to share with us as we're chatting today?
Or questions. I mean, I think this is such an important topic. I can't imagine anybody not having questions. So I'm free to answer.
Sure.
My opinions and thoughts.
So I did love the way you updated the heralds and the shining ones. I think I finally can appreciate them. There was something just a little bit odd about the heralds, or what did we call them previously? We called them
the
I'm sorry.
strongholds. The
The strongholds, yes. There was something a little odd about. I think it was the chess pieces that threw me, maybe. But I knew what you were doing from your book of maps, but I do love these. I think I think you really have found the sweet spot with your deck, getting everything to be part of a unified world, which is why I didn't mind the change to the world card when you in the Vitruvian, because I realized it went more with the world that you were creating. Even though I still love that first card, and I'm probably going to steal ideas from it when I get to the world card
Please do so. Oh my God. Happy.
myself. So Ange says that she doesn't have any questions, but she wants to express her gratitude for all the thoughts that had gone into the SKT. I'm learning so much. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So Tampai has a question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I do find that the first edition, I love it a lot, and yet you can see that it's very raw, right? Like you can see that there's a rawness to the first edition where I don't want to say it's half baked, because that's not fair either. It's not half baked, but you can see that it is raw, and then you can see sort of the sophistication evolve with the technical skill level, and so that's something that I think is both good and bad, right?
Yeah, there is one card I want to talk about in a minute, but Tampai did have a question. She said every time that she looks at the Shining One, she can't help but think about Stephen King. I guess because of The Shining.
It's from the angel hierarchy. You know how there's I think in Christian and Catholic tradition, but then it was borrowed from Zoroastrian tradition earlier. There's this idea of an angel hierarchy. So the Shining Ones was one hierarchy of angels. That's the reason I went with that.
Yeah, I like that in this deck. They are angels, but you can read them as just normal court cards as well, because of the way you've depicted them. I think that going with the halo effect that you did versus the wings that were in the original actually really works in those cards. I think the wings were some of what I struggled with in those images too previously myself. Let's see.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people are just getting the SKT. Simon at the Hermit's Cave said he got it for Christmas, and Gerald had just received his. In fact, he was watching the video earlier this week that I did, talking about the various decks and comparing them. There is only one card in this deck that I still struggle with a bit. And let me see if I can pull it out and we can talk about it while you guys are thinking of questions for the fabulous Benebell Wen. Where is she?
I guess while you're looking, I have a question for you, Rosemary.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on representation in tarot? How do you see representation in tarot? How do you feel about that as a tarot reader?
So for me, it's never really bothered me, because I I've always been okay with the kind of seeming duality of things, because I don't think you can have a spectrum without the polar opposites, right? You have to have a point on the ends to actually compare things to for there to be a spectrum, to in my mind at least. And so I've always looked at the tarot and thought these could be anyone. I guess because I didn't look at these, for example, the Waite Smith, which I worked with primarily for about 10 years. When I looked at it, the apparel meant nothing to me as far as whether they were male or female. I was basically looking at their faces and their body types. And for me, a lot of the cards in that deck could be intersex, could be male or female. Um, unless unless you knew the intention, unless you knew what the clothing represented in that time and era, at least in my brain. So like people are always talking about how all the pages are men and all the knights are men and all the kings are men. There's just too many men. And I'm like, I always thought some of the pages were women, looking at the pixie images.
They were pretty androgynous, if you want to be completely honest, right? In terms of the actual artistic depiction.
Right. Yeah. So the card that I'm still struggling with just a little bit is the pugilist.
Oh, the pugilist.
Pugilist, yes, because I don't, for some, that name had no meaning for me. And so I've read the Book of Maps and I kind of get what's going on there, but yeah, it kind of changes the focus for me of the card. Like normally it's on that person that is experiencing that moment in the Nine of Swords, but to me the focus here is more on the spirit.
Hecate, yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, when I was pugilism is it's boxing, it's fighting, it's fist fighting, but it also goes back to and pugilism is used in wuxia. Wuxia it's Chinese martial arts. It's the translation of that. It's this idea of a warrior who doesn't necessarily follow the code of law, but has their own very strong sense of code of ethics. And so you will break the law in order to follow your own code of ethics, and you will never deviate from your own code of ethics, even if that means revolting against the emperor, revolting against the dominant orthodoxy. And so that's sort of the very, very bottom foundation of that idea. And so when you see the figure who is bending and kneeling to Hecate, he's going like this. This is the traditional, it's like a sign of respect. I don't know how to explain it, but it's a way of, like there's a code of ethics and martial arts and code of honor in this particular hand gesture. And so I wanted to emphasize Hecate, this idea of sort of bowing to a higher ideal in the way you fight, in the way you present yourself as an offense or defense. And I don't know if that came out as well, but that was where I was going with it. And so I did want the focus to be the divine, because it's the divine within us. So when we are strong as a defense mechanism or an offense mechanism, it's when the concept of the divine in us are actualized. That's what I was thinking, at least.
Looking at the chat here to see what it looks like. Yeah, several people are like, yeah, it was the SKT was my Christmas gift to myself. When I ordered it, I actually ordered it late because initially I wasn't going to get it because I loved the first edition and have continued to work with it. And so I finally decided, after seeing the cards over and over again and your videos starting to come out about walking through it, I was like, you know what? I should just go ahead and complete the family, because I'd originally gotten the Vitruvian as a backup for the first edition because I couldn't get another copy of it. And but I actually think the Revelation is going to be the working deck, because now the spirits that were represented in the first edition are present. I feel like it's a cycle that's come to fulfillment, basically, and it reads so well. And it, like you've said in your videos, you can read it like any tarot deck, or you can dive into all of the esoteric information that is in it.
I hope people do experience it that way, where it's kind of like the engine of a car. You can open the hood of your engine of your vehicle and try to figure out how the heck your engine works, and that's going to be a very complicated process. Or you can just drive your damn car, right? And so I'm hoping people see that even though I try to put as much programming, intentional programming into the cards as possible, on one level, you can still just read it, and you can read it intuitively. You can read it in a very spontaneous way. And I hope people can see that.
Okay. So Gerald was just recently gifted a copy of the Vitruvian, which is actually pretty amazing considering the price that they're going for on some websites. Yeah. Let's see. There was a conversation here about skirts. I want to go see what that was. Let's see. So I know a lot of people feel the way that Gerald does, is that they like to see themselves represented in decks. And we get a lot of decks like that nowadays. One of the decks that I've started working with in the last year that for a long time I didn't want, because it changes everything, is the Numinous Tarot. And, when I see the names of the suits changed and the names of the cards, and it always frustrated me. So I was like, yeah, no, that's not for me. But I'm really loving working with it. And I think it's because I definitely see myself in that deck. Well, it's kind of like I did in that first edition world card from the SKT. It really made me connect with it.
I think that is something interesting about being from a marginalized class, is at least in one generation, right? We got so used to not seeing ourselves. We found a way to just settle. Like, you find a way to settle with the dominant imagery and find a way to creatively tell your own story through what you see. And then you begin to be like, oh, I don't really need representation. It's okay. I don't need the representation. And then when you actually see the actual representation of your real story, it changes everything. Like, oh, wow. So this is what I've been missing. It's a really interesting switch in a particular generation of us, because we grew up not seeing ourselves in media. And then while in our lifetime, suddenly there was a switch, and now you see representation of yourself. So I think, it's a really interesting psychological switch,
Right. Yeah. I totally understand that. I feel like, as I was describing earlier with the RWS, I learned to work with it,
Yeah.
and by my own, the way I looked at it, and, but I'm still playing with the idea, because I don't think there's a really great, clone out there right now that, adds racial and gender diversity. I kind of want to take my new markers and color my Centennial, like just vary the skin tones, and maybe add some things to it too, because when I look at it now, I love it. It's beautiful, but it has very little representation, whereas most of the decks I get now, they have so much more. Either they've chosen not to use people, or they have switched it up, and they have women as kings, and men as queens, and that type of thing.
I think for me, I take the decks within the context of the moment in time that the decks came from, right? And so I remind myself that actually with Crowley, these individuals, on some level, they were socially very progressive in their time. They might not be seen as that today, but just remembering that things come from a very specific zeitgeist. And so to impose new, evolved, enlightened understanding on a period before that evolution and enlightenment, I don't think that's fair either,
Gotcha. So the conversation about skirts earlier was, they were saying the pages, I guess, or some of them are wearing tunics or skirt type things. That's why sometimes they look like women to me, maybe, in the RWS. and it's similar to the Fool. The Fool has that kind of medium length hair and a tunic, so it's easy to make that variation. Yeah, so Simon says, yeah, he has no issue with historical decks, but modern decks, you want to see that representation, that current understanding and enlightenment, basically, in the cards.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah. Boy. Let's see. I have actually been working with the I Ching on it this week. At the bottom of the cards, for those of you who haven't seen it or haven't looked closely yet, she has I Ching trigrams. So this week for my Instagram, I have been pulling 2 cards for the energy of the day and looking at those. And what's interesting to me is that regardless of how many cards are in my spread, when I look at those trigrams and that form the hexagram, and then I look up that hexagram, it pretty much sums up the reading to me in a way. What is that? Is that intentional? Is it supposed to work that way? Or, what was that? Yeah. So was that intentional?
The result was not intentional in the sense that I couldn't have forced that to happen, because I began at the root. I began with the 8 trigrams, which are fundamental elements. So I did a lot of, I guess, a form of philosophical mathematics, right? So I went back to basics and thought about how do you reconcile the 4 elements in Western alchemy with the 8 trigrams in Eastern alchemy and the wuxing, the 5 changing phases. So that's where I began. And then I thought about and then to understand that, to do a mathematical construct of that, I went into physics and started thinking about different physics problems. And that's where it's explained in the Book of Maps. So using physics problems to figure out how to do some kind of an architecture and correspondence system between the I Ching and the tarot is where I began. So then after I figured out that correspondence system, then we just do our own output. You pull the cards, you get the I Ching trigrams that form the hexagram. And like by fluke, it just worked out in that way that the oracles really, really align. So that part was unintentional, but the initial reconciliation process was very, very intentional.
Yeah, and I think people other than myself have noticed this. Maya says, I had the same experience with the hexagrams. They're so well integrated into the tarot meanings. She says, I mapped out the way Benebell corresponded to the trigrams, and it's rather elegant. So I was not really familiar with the I Ching until you added it to your deck, and I began to look at it. I've been struggling for a long time to decide how yin and yang fit into my correspondences. I have a system that I've been creating myself from the first time I studied tarot to today, and as I've studied more and more, I've realized that okay, what I'm creating was already done by someone else, but I had not seen it yet. And so, and basically I'm talking about the rose cross and the correspondences in that fashion. But in trying to figure out how, these ideas that you've placed into the SKT from, the I Ching and Taoism and other practices relate to those Western correspondences. So it's fun. I like to work with those kind of brain things. Gerald would like to know what you like about your tarot practice.
What do I like about my tarot practice? Right now, for me, the quickest response I can think of is proof of God. For me, it is this tool, it's a language system. And this language system is so fluid and malleable and universal in a way that all of the different systems, which is why there's that whole question of does Kabbalah and tarot go together, right? And now it's I Ching, although Aleister Crowley talked about I Ching and tarot correspondences way back in the day. So this idea that all of these different constructs can all universally be reduced in a way that is sustainable within the tarot architecture, to me, is proof of God. And God, not necessarily in this like, man up in the sky God, right? God as in some kind of a universal divine, some kind of a solidarity of everything, a pantheistic concept of God. So that's what I love the most about my tarot practice right now, is it's a way of me communing with the divine.
So these are some of the same things going through my mind, but I could not speak nearly as eloquently as you about them. And that's why I wanted you here today to talk about gender in particular, because I didn't think I could articulate it quite that way. And so glad that you were. Simon says that's a mic drop moment there. Proof of God. So I'm not familiar with the handle tarot. Tammy Pie says that the I Ching is used in it as well. Are you familiar with the handle?
Oh, a Handel Tarot. Yeah, Rachel Pollack wrote the guidebooks for it. It's amazing. I love the Handel Tarot. Or Heindel. I think it's pronounced Heindel Tarot, but don't quote me on it.
It's kind of the whole message of Revelation. So
Tarot of Ceremonial Magic is another one. Lon Milo Duquette also worked on the correspondence system between tarot and I Ching. So there's been several individuals. It's been going on for a very long time. It is certainly not new. I did not start it at all.
So are they similar in their associations? Not at all.
No, they're very different.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I think that the fact that when we do the hexagrams with your deck, we're basically getting a summary of our readings means that you've come close. That it works, and I think when it works, that's just proof that we're getting close to accuracy. So Tampai had said in relation to the proof of God comment that's kind of appears to be the whole message of Revelation, and I think she's right about that. Let's see. So yeah, and Ange was saying that communing with the divine, is how she works with the tarot, or at least how it feels to her. I say that's true for me at sometimes, particularly when I'm working with the Spirit Keepers Tarot, or the Thoth, perhaps. But like sometimes it's just throwing down some cards and seeing what's there, right?
Absolutely.
What jumps out at you? All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in. I did want to thank you so much for being here and talking about your deck and about gender in Esoteric Tarot. And I may ask you some more questions about this, probably in the Discord server. So for those of you who are interested in esoteric topics like astrology and tarot and numerology, Mutus Liber is the name of the Discord server that Benebell and I are on. And you can join the conversation there if you like. Feel free to reach out to me if you need a link or anything like that. Want to thank our moderators today, Ange and Gerald, and for everybody who popped in and said hello. Don't forget, tomorrow I will have my weekly live, 78 cards in 78 weeks, and hope to see you everyone there. Until then, good journeys, everyone.